Welcome to episode 63 of the Adam Makes Beer Industry Pro podcast. Today, I'm excited to be chatting with Dr. Matt Winans of Fermentis. Before we get rolling, let me give a shout out to our fantastic sponsors that make content like this possible. Starting a brewery is a big step. Blickman Engineering is here to help. Since 2006, they've equipped hundreds of nanobreweries for success. Their new 3.5 barrel Pro Surface electric brewing system cuts maintenance and saves at least 30 minutes per brew with powerful under kettle heating. From 1 to 15 barrel brew houses to keg washers and grain mills, Blickman has what you need. Ready to go pro? Contact Phil or Tom at ProSeries at blickmanengineering.com. Blickman Engineering is a proud sponsor of this channel and loves to help brewers at every stage of their journey. Tracking and managing the financial health of your brewery is a primary pillar of success. Check out my boy David Lentz at Brewed Fiscally. This man has the industry experience and skills you need so you can focus on growing your business. Bookkeeping, fractional CFO support, financial management system design, business plan review, hit up your boy. Check him out at brewedfiscally.com or shoot him an email at david@brewedfiscally.com. He's good people. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Matt Winans, who is a leading fermentation scientist and yeast expert in the craft beer world, currently serving as technical sales support manager at Fermentis, specializing in yeast and fermentation solutions. With a PhD in yeast systems biology from West Virginia University, Matt has combined deep academic training with hands-on brewing industry experience to shape innovative yeast products and sensory practices. Dr. Matt, good to have you on today.
Hey, Adam, thanks for inviting me. It's been a long time coming, I know, and happy to chat with you. So
absolutely. For sure. So you started out at West Virginia University. How far? So I went to school in Southeast Ohio, right where West Virginia kind of creeps up between Ohio and Pennsylvania. So I was like 45 minutes from Pittsburgh. So I was in Steubenville, Ohio. How far away? Did you have any idea where that is compared to where you were?
I do, yeah. Steubenville's not so far. I'd say maybe I'd have to look at the map, but maybe an hour, right?
Yeah.
Is it close to Wheeling? It's
Yeah,
south of Wheeling, right?
Absolutely. We used to go out to Wheeling sometimes down there. Just a little old steel town. So yeah, absolutely. I didn't realize that I didn't realize that that's kind of where things started off for you. Now, are you a West Virginia guy? Were you born and raised there?
I am. I'm from West by God, Virginia, as they say, and I grew up in Parkersburg. It's the third largest city or town, depending on how you want to count it, in West Virginia, and it is on that Ohio border. So, if you go up and down the Ohio River, you can get to Wheeling, I'd say, in about an hour and a half. Morgantown's 2 hours. I'm in Cincinnati right now. It's about 3 hours drive by car.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is that I didn't realize that, because I'm located outside. I'm about an hour away from Rheingeist. I know you're doing some work with Rheingeist today, or at least soon.
Right, tomorrow.
Yeah, nice.
Well, we should have done this in person.
Yeah, well, I've never really done one in person before. The schedule on my side is a little crazy right now, but yeah, it would have been funny when you hit me up yesterday. I didn't realize we were gonna be so close. So, well, let's dig into a little bit of your path into the industry. You mentioned that you did was it your undergrad, or did you go all the way through PhD at West Virginia? What was that kind of educational path like for you?
Yeah, so I spent a long time, I'd say, in the academic world, but the high school in West Virginia, we're going all the way back to high school. I went to high school in West Virginia. I got my undergrad in West Virginia. I did some study abroad. I was living in Turks and Caicos for some small time. I was really interested in marine biology, and I've always been interested in biology. So, I think my passion first started for home brewing when I took Bio 101 in undergrad, and my professor, Pam Huggins, Dr. Pam Huggins, that is, she talked about the first time she tried to make home beer and it exploded on her. And I don't know why, but for some reason, as a 18-year-old guy, I was like, whoa, people make beer. That's so cool. And it just kind of like opened up this world. We went into senior year, we went into more of like genetics.
Mm-hmm.
So I was homebrewing actively by that time. And I was like, wow, there's like a lot of connections here. And my professors were really into it. It took me several years to end up choosing that as a model organism, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, to go and do my doctorate in. But that's kind of, I guess, how I continued on to higher education.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I always like how there's kind of different paths into, kind of the fascination of it, right? Because there is, I think sometimes we can take for granted with the food we eat, how much, this is going to sound like a dumb guy thing to say, but biologically, how many things are going on, because on a baseline level, you can think, well, okay, I could just go buy fruits, meats, and vegetables from the store. And then you get on into things that are fermented and whatnot. But sometimes we don't always draw those bigger connections. And then you start realizing, oh, there's these deeper ties into different things.
I think you nailed it. I mean, honestly, for me, I wasn't really a foodie. I didn't get exposed to a whole lot of stuff, growing up. And I would say for me, once I started getting into fermentation, I started homebrewing, right? And then I started getting into this world of yeast where I'm looking at these strains names that I'm doing research on. First thing I looked at was an AWRI, or the Australian Wine Research Institute.
Uh-huh.
And so I just started asking around, using the internet browser, searching, and ended up finding that it was the Australian Wine Research Institute. So I really just started digging into strain history. And from there, it really opened up a world of fermentation, not only with, brewing, but I can talk more about how I got involved with sake in Japan. And when I moved to Portland, I started really getting into, it's a craft beer hub. It's also a culinary hub. So there's all these foods, and my palate at that point is starting to really kind of, I get trained. And in the last 2 years or so, almost 2 years, I've been with Fermentis in this position. And I've traveled to a lot of different countries, and I've also been trying different foods and beers. And really, I'm actually kind of ashamed to say that when I first started in craft beer, I didn't really like Belgian beers. Because all the sours that I had were kind of American sours, which I still appreciate.
Uh-huh.
But I remember entering, I think maybe a lot of people had the same point of view, but I was like, oh, it's sour, it's spoiled. And I've got a really great appreciation for it now.
Well, and it is one of those things. And I always say that I feel like, I remember when I wanted to, early on when I got into home brewing, and then I was equally diving into beer judging, and I wanted to have like an amazing palate, and I wanted to have an amazing palate right now. And so I'm the kind of guy that, the first time I went to my buddy's house, now this is a little dated, but the first time I went to my buddy's house and they were playing Texas Hold'em, I lost my rear end. Okay. And they pummeled me. And so I went out and I bought Doyle Brunson's Super System, which at the time was like this. It's a great big book that explains how to play this game and how to win at this game. And so I'm like, okay, if I want to be good at something, I'm going to find out everything I can, and then I'm going to go back and try to hurt my loved one's feelings, with my newfound information. So, but I try to apply the same thing to developing my palate, like just this big, I'm just going to learn as much stuff as possible. But there's also something to be said about actually just experience and time and tasting, right? And then so I love that you talked about, being exposed to all these different experiences. 'Cause I think sometimes when people think about, building your palate as a beer judge, it's building your palate in general. It's food, it's what you walk around smelling outside, it's beer itself, all those things are input. So yeah, I think it's really, really interesting. So you've been doing the last, how long have you been with Fermentis now?
So I joined Fermentis in January 2024. So I've been
January
with Fermentis for, I think it's January 15th, actually.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'd say 1 year and almost a little bit over 7 months.
From a sensory standpoint, and you can go one of two ways. You could give me a food example and you could give me a beer example. What's been one of those eye-opening things that, through your travels or whatever, a food or beverage thing that has really jumped out to you? Just whether it be just something, hey, I love this dish, I love this beer, or anything like that.
Well, I would say for me, when it comes to beer, right? I talked a little bit earlier about how when I first started, I didn't like sour beers. Because a lot of the sour beers were kind of like hit you in the face with some acid, and I've gotten a greater appreciation now for some really great sour beers. There's Flanders Red style. For me, it was a really pivotal moment when I got to travel to the Rodenbach Brewing Company and see the giant fooders, and then taste, and then also not only taste them but to really see how these beers come to be with their mixing, the ratios, and the classic like acetic acid, the vinegar aspect of that style. But I would say for me, the Belgian beers, specifically like Orval and Rodenbach, those are kind of near and dear to my heart now. And the acetic, I think some of that Brett character, and like I've actually come to the point, I think, where my palate is able to discern some of the differences between different Bretts, like Brett Brooks, Brett C. So it's really interesting. I never thought I would get to that point, if I'm being completely honest.
Sure.
10 years ago, I would have been shocked to hear that.
Sure.
But yeah, I think as far as beer goes, that's definitely a couple highlights for me. And then I think something else that's happened to me, I think in my life as I've progressed just in the last decade, I started growing plants more now, and I have all these tomatoes that I'm growing, and I'm able to really taste beer pH. I mean, I can't dial it. I'm on a pH meter, but I can tell what's more acidic and somewhat, what kind of acids are in there. And so for me, it's super interesting when I'm growing different varieties of tomatoes, and I'm like more or less doing this sensory experiment, and it's like, am I working or am I doing a hobby at the moment? I don't know, but it's really become a large aspect of my life that I thoroughly enjoy, and there's a lot of crossover.
It's so much fun too, because my wife and I have a pretty robust garden, and it is, I don't know, one of the things the crossovers between the brewing and culinary side, the crossovers are so great. Even if you're just looking at it as a way of like, all right, so how am I creating balance, whether it be in a beer or in a pasta sauce or anything like that. Absolutely. So tell me about your role right now with Fermentis. Kind of what's your role? What are the, I don't know, what are some of the main kind of day-to-day things that you work on?
Yeah, so my role is a little bit different day to day. I really operate more so week to week and month to month. But so technically, okay. So my title is I'm a technical sales support manager. And the way that the company operates is we have sales reps, which all the people on our team are super great, super technical. And actually, when I joined, I was always impressed. I met someone else, I meet someone new, find out what they do on the team, and I got some of their background. I'm always like, wow, I can't believe I work with all these people with these great experiences. And what I do is I'm kind of the bridge between our sales reps who communicate mostly with our customers and R&D, and then also basically relaying any kind of technical information. So somewhat translation If there's an issue with, I don't know, let's say someone has an issue with the yeast or they have a technical question, usually I'll jump on a call with them. And so like maybe they're trying to implement a new strain, help with trials. If there's like, I might talk about this a little bit later, but if there's like some experimental products or new products we're developing, I work in that field, and I also have some select partners, whether it's academic or industrial, that I work with, and I help plan experiments, interpret data.
Nice.
So it's really a role that I really, really enjoy. And I came from a small liquid yeast company. I was at Imperial Yeast before I joined Fermentis. And one thing I really liked there was the hands-on experience and the experimental, day-to-day that I did. So in my position now, I still have that aspect where maybe I'm not the guy with a pipette, but I am still involved deeply with interpretation, setting up the experimental design, which is a huge portion of experiments, because you have to have the right design and the right controls.
Yeah. Well, you have to have parameters. And this might be kind of an oversimplification, but in my mind, it's one of those things where if you're trying to dial in a beer, I can't be changing 8 different variables in the beer and thinking that I'm going to be getting something, that I'm going to be getting valuable information out of that, because it could be any of the 8 things.
Yeah, exactly. Especially with troubleshooting too. It's like, I'll hear a problem. I'll say, well, it could be A, B, or C.
Yes.
My A, B, and C, these levels, I think this one's too high, this one's too low, this one needs to be adjusted. And they're like, okay, I'll do all this. So I'm like, whoa. Let's not do all those at once.
Yes.
Let's take route A first and, hit it, give it our best shot.
Well, and so I think that's interesting because, when there's so many variables that go into troubleshooting a problem. So whether this be at Fermentis or with your time at Imperial, have you ever had that situation where you have a brewer calling with an issue and they want like a very simple answer, but the reality is there's so many inputs. There's so many inputs. There's so many different realities about what's going on. And one of the things that I find is, the more I dig into things, I remember when I was homebrewing, I did have a good lesson hammered into my head at that point, where it was like, I need to, because at that point I was buying liquid yeast. And so I would oftentimes need to prop it up with a starter. And then I would need to make sure my wort is oxygenated. So I would have the appropriate pitching rate. I would have oxygenated wort, and then I had my temperature, and I was good to go. And then as I start learning and growing as a brewer, I learn about nutrients. I learn a little bit more about O2, and I realized that the length between my the hose or process pipe length between my heat exchanger to my tank can impact the amount of CO or the amount of O2 that's actually getting into solution in that beer. And then if I didn't mention yeast nutrient, there's all these different things, right? And then there's harvesting, how and when it's harvested. Do you feel as if people not understanding the range of elements that go into figuring out what their yeast problem is? Is that something that you experienced when you were helping people?
Yeah, sometimes. But, I don't blame anyone for that, because we're all in a learning process. So, you don't know what you don't know. And so when you're trying to troubleshoot, you ask people. And sometimes, you might ask people a silly question, or what's silly to someone, it's a giant learning experience for someone else, because at the end of the day, we're all trying to, grow and have good beer and have great yeast. And so, I think those are all, different aspects of troubleshooting and yeast management. Even oxygenation, temperature is a huge role as well.
Yeah. So what was it like going from Imperial, because I know Imperial ships yeast all over the United States. They have the 2 labs in Portland and then Philly, and then working for like an international yeast supplier, and also somebody that does, I believe, do they do all dry yeast? Is that?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
What was that? What was that like? Kind of that transition.
we are primarily a dry yeast company,
Sure.
Fermentis is. And I mean, there obviously we grow yeast. We have plants in many different areas of the world, and so it starts off as liquid. So we're not totally exclusive to dry yeast. We have many different formats, but we're a unit of I guess an umbrella company called LaSaf,
Hmm.
and it's a 200+ year old company. Really interesting history there. But I would say transitioning from a smaller kind of craft beer liquid yeast company like Imperial to Fermentis, it's exciting, right? Anything new that you're doing is always exciting.
Sure.
And I've said it before, I think like a growth mindset is super important too. And so that's not just when you're transitioning to a new role or you're trying something new. It's just like a constant way to look at things. So I remember when I was finishing my doctorate, I was looking at different yeast companies. There was a point, because I had my own consulting company called Appalachian Brewer Research at the time. And so I was interviewing at a couple different yeast companies, and there's a biotech company that I was interviewing at. And, honestly, for me and my trajectory, I went with Imperial for a lot of different reasons. I had some personal relationships that were out in Oregon. Also, it was just like a really cool time to be with craft beer and a liquid yeast startup company. They're at a point where they were growing and they were about to expand into a new building. And I just had all these experiences where I was at West Virginia University, operating a lab. I had just been to the National Research Institute of Brewing in Japan, also Saga University. I've been living out there and doing research. I had been visiting a couple other laboratories. And so I had this wealth of laboratory visits, knowledge, and how I've been kind of consulting for quality control with breweries and distilleries. And so to take all that and the opportunity I got was amazing. Love all the guys at Imperial. But I was able to build a lab up from the ground up, from everything from the flooring to the equipment to the counter space to what kind of plates. It was really just a holistic, and it's an experience that I think made me pretty well rounded at the end of the 3 years I was there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Most people don't have, there's only a handful of places in the US where, people are propagating and selling yeast out of, for what did you hear from, because I'm assuming you were in the Portland area, correct? Were you in Portland?
Yes.
For that? Yeah.
I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah. And so when you were there, what, I'm assuming you had brewers that would come to the facility or you would talk to them. I've never been in that sort of production environment. What are some things that brewers don't know about like the yeast production side of things?
That's difficult to say because everyone's got their own background knowledge.
Sure.
And some breweries, they do propagate their own yeast. And whether they go from slants or they go from a liquid pitch or even a brick, and they start it up that way and get it to pitchable like industrial batch size. I would say that there's a lot of similarities. At the end of the day, I think the biggest difference is knowing each yeast strain, because the real challenge, right? It's not. Growing yeast, it's not easy. It's not necessarily hard. But doing it in the best way possible, that's something that separates, an amateur from a professional. And then also when you're doing it at the level that, Fermentis, Imperial, and the other liquid yeast labs do it, you're dealing with, maybe they have 20 to 30 strains that they deal with regularly, 100 or 1,000 that they deal with, yearly or however long, but there's tons of different strains, and the way that you grow them, they're the fermentation profile, the way that they attenuate, temperature, flocculation, all that stuff is different. And so when you grow them, you have to know that, and you have to be able to harvest it correctly. And then at the end of the day, what you're looking for is a liquid pitch that you can, or liquid or a dry, right? That you can use to create, consistent and the best quality beer that you can.
Sure. I hear a lot of brewers, different brewers will swear by the same strain, but held by different labs. So can you talk on that a little bit? Because sometimes I have some buddies that like to make Hefeweizen, and they'll say,
Love the
"Oh,
style."
well, yeah. Well, I love the strain from this lab, but it's different over here." Is that your experience? Is when I buy Cal Ale from X supplier, is it the same Cal Ale that I'm going to be purchasing from Z supplier? What does that look like?
That's a great question, Adam.
Thanks, man.
Yeah. To be honest with you, it really just depends on what strain and what supplier. It could be very much similar. It could also be very different.
Sure.
Because breweries transfer. Depends on where the strain was acquired from. It could be directly from the source. It could be a repitch. Someone could mislabel things. So it really just depends on the details here. So if we're talking about, let's say like a Hefeweizen strain, there's a couple of really popular ones out there. And I would say if you can get one that is like certified from the source, because that's the way most brewers that I know talk about where's this yeast from? It's like, what brewery did it come from? Or maybe what part of the country or what country, even region that it came from. So I would say something that has a really good reputation and being true to the region, or something that you have really good experience with. Now, whether or not the second part, or maybe this is the whole point of your question, whether or not Chico Ale yeast from, supplier X, supplier Y is the same, I have no idea. I will say that a lot of times they're really similar, right? Chico is a really popular variety. I've worked with it a lot in my day. And I will say that if you're interested in this, I know the girl to talk to. So Maitreya Dunham out of University of Washington has done some extensive genetic work on this, where she actually has gone and taken Chico, and maybe W3470 was the other one she did, but definitely Chico for sure. Maybe London 3 might be the other one. I forget exactly. But she's taken it from different suppliers, right? And has either sequenced, or I forget exactly how it worked, but pretty sure she sequenced them and then tracked the SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, over time, with serial repitching, and then also from different suppliers. So if you talk with her, she probably has some idea in her head about, what supplier got yeast from what other supplier at what time, maybe how many repitches they came from another brewery, and at what point does that become its own yeast strain? I don't know. It's a great question.
Well, you said something in there that made me think. Repitching it's a very valuable tool, both from a quality standpoint and from a financial standpoint. What do you feel as if are some of the keys? Because I know some people that just seem to throw caution to the wind, and they're like, oh, we're on generation 150 with this yeast, and then some other people are like, oh, I won't go past generation 3 with my pitches. What are some of your thoughts on repitching, and I don't know, maybe some of the best ways to do that effectively?
Yeah, so I'll answer this in a couple different ways. So I would say the first way I'll answer it is for me, the rule of thumb is about 5 repitches.
Mm-hmm.
After that, you start to get more into genetic drift, and what ends up happening, and I know a lot of brewers that have done this, and sometimes it's just the way the brewery operates, or sometimes they do it just to see how far they can push it.
Mm-hmm.
I think when I was at Imperial, I think we got a couple of lager yeast coming in that were on generation 70 or something like that, and it was way different.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is genetic drift over time. And so some of the complications that happen with that is, you get inconsistent with your brewing. And so that can be a lot of things. It's inconsistent kinetics, it's inconsistent attenuation, and inconsistent flavor profile. And so, the whole idea of, making really good craft beer and keeping the industry together and, elevating the bar of brewing science is that you want to make good beer and you want to do it consistently, because again, we all want to, have good value when we pay, $10-15 for a 4-pack now. I think that's somewhere around the price range. And so, you want those customers to come back, because if it's inconsistent, eventually they're going to pick up on that. And so, that's what I would say about how many times you could repitch. Some of the characteristics that I find after repitching has gone on too long. Then I guess the third part of the question is, how would I address doing it? So for me, I think your nutrient is going to be really important. I also think that the way that you handle your yeast and the timing of harvest and then repitching is really important. If you're really abusive to your yeast, don't reuse it. It's really best, especially if you're making a light-bodied ale or something like that, and you're going into higher gravity fermentations, you want to kind of baby it up to there and get it used to it. But just really giving it the best practices. So making sure there's not a lot of thermal stress to it, not a lot of oxygenation stress. If you're using dry yeast, for instance, if you're not over 15-degree Plato for your starting gravity, you can just pitch dry. That's what I recommend, right into the fermenter. And then you can harvest the yeast just like you would any other time. And some rule of thumb when you're harvesting is, if you are, again, I would harvest and repitch 5 times or less, and that's like you can be able to count on one hand. And then another rule of thumb is, when you're harvesting your yeast, before you use it again, so like your turnaround time, if you can measure it in hours, that's great. I mean, that's the best. If you're measuring in days, it's like okay. If you're measuring in weeks, that's definitely a no-go. If you go any further than that, it's kind of like, are you running an experiment? I'm not sure if you're running a business. I don't know what you're doing. We get calls on that, but I would say those are some important characteristics to keep in mind when you're harvesting and repitching, and it can be a good practice. And I think the final thought I have on that, as I'm kind of walking through this with you, is, at a certain point, we all want to save money, but it becomes like a math. If you're in a business part, it becomes like a math equation. How much is the risk worth it to save $20 or whatever it might be?
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And you brought up a point that I think is really interesting, where I remember when I was at CBC, I believe I was maybe at a booth of another dry yeast manufacturer, and I was talking to somebody, and sometimes I don't know how I come off, but hopefully I came off the right way. But
Adam, you're always pleasant with me.
What? Well, it was,
and you
funny.
Had a great laugh too. So
well, thank you. But so listen, so anyways, I mean, I'm just doing the trade show. I'm talking to whoever. I go up to these people. I know they're slinging dry yeast, and I'm like, hey, listen.
Slinging dry yeast. Okay. Is that how you talk about me when I'm not around?
He's slinging dry yeast, man. So anyways, I'm like, hey, listen. When I was coming up, when I read the yeast book by the Brewers Association, And I know that the book was written a while ago. I also know whose name is listed as one of the authors on that. I know that it's a liquid yeast guy. But in that book, it said, if I add dry yeast directly to wort without rehydrating, I'm going to get 50% mortality. Now, the gentleman that I was speaking to scoffed at the notion, and started talking to me about some of the research on that. So now this is something that's in, it's not like an internet rumor, because it's in a book from the Brewers Association. Can you peel back some layers on that a little bit? Because I've come to the experience of, because I believe it's Fermentis started actually advertising that you can direct pitch the brick right to your cooled wort, and I've had no issues with it. It's been tremendously successful for me. So is there something that's different that happened in the meantime? Yeah, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I
Because
can help peel back some of
yeah.
those layers.
Sure.
I mean, I think I would just like to start off by saying, over time, I think as suppliers and brewers, we've just gotten smarter. Earlier, I said that we just don't know what we don't know. And, I think that the idea of rehydration has carried over from the bread making industry and also the wine making industry. The wine making industry, they still rehydrate for the most part. And so what I've heard, I've been with Fermentis under 2 years now, and they were getting a lot of claims from just the field brewers being like, oh, I dump it in, there's no issue, it's great. And so the 50% mortality that you reference, that's an odd thing for me, because I know that the way that we and probably many other suppliers do this, right, is that they will rehydrate or reconstitute either. And I think we're using wort. Actually, I don't quote me on what we use to rehydrate.
Sure.
But if you look at your COA, what you're going to see is the guaranteed viability per cell or per gram. And so the BSG published a post not too long ago, and we're 1 times 10 to the 10th. So that's how many yeast cells are viable per gram, which is a huge number. It's actually the best in the industry. But rehydrating and wort is probably the best method. We did do some studies. I've seen the studies, I've seen the data, and there's a couple key takeaways that I get from there. For me, rehydrating before you pitch, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless you're doing some kind of specialty kind of treatment. And the specialty treatments for me, the only way that I would rehydrate would be for specialty treatments, and that includes like a bottle conditioning strain. We have F2, and it's supposed to cling to the bottles, provides a good carbonation. We have another Brettanomyces strain that people use to bottle condition. So those would be the 2 times that I would use rehydration. You can do that with any bottle condition with any yeast, but those 2 examples are the most common. Direct pitch is definitely the best because you have nutrients in there. You have a good and direct pitch at fermentation temperature. Some people say to do it a little bit above, slightly warmer. You can do that, but it's just another variable. You don't need to do that. So for me, direct pitch, fermentation temperature, definitely the way to go. There's really no difference between, there's slight difference, but really no difference between that and using water. Not a big deal either way. When I was home brewing, we talked a lot about like rehydration every once in a while. There's always like one person that wants to really harp on it and tell you can't use chlorinated water, you can't use tap water, you can't, you have to use distilled, or, use mountain spring that has been RO'd, or whatever the story is. It really makes no difference that we've seen. I'd say major takeaways from that. Number 1, COAs are going to tell you exactly what you're going to get when you rehydrate. Dry yeast is good for 3 years, which is a huge shelf life. Strains vary. So we have more strains that are robust. We have some strains that are more sensitive. So just talk with your supplier. But your COA is going to tell you a lot of information. Rehydrate with direct pitch, fermentation temperatures, and then I would say also the things that you want to avoid are alcohol. If there's any alcohol in the rehydration media, that's a big no-no. That will kill a lot of stuff very quick, and so that's the reason why if you're doing bottle conditioning, you want to rehydrate separately. So that, and if you have like a pump, right, and you're doing vigorous agitation, that also takes the quality down. So you'll kill some cells when they first rehydrate. Rehydration takes around 20 minutes, then it's ready to go to work.
So that actually made me think about something, because I know there are different, you can look at this across a couple of different ways. Where my mind goes is introducing a dry yeast product as a co-pitch. So not at the same time, but as leveraging a quote unquote clean strain, my air quotes are not on, along with, so whether or not you're using, because they'll sell like clean acidifying yeast that you can use on the cold side. It generates its acid up front, but then sometimes you would want to co-pitch a traditional cleaner strain with it. How much is pH and acidity a factor in that dry pitching scenario? Is acidity something that can affect that rehydration process?
I'm sure that with extremes, acidity or alkalinity can affect it, but I think in the beer terms, I don't think it really affects it too much. I can go back and double check. I can get really technical, but I haven't really heard of any cases where that's a huge issue.
Sure.
Of course, when you're thinking about proteins, cells, if you get in the extremes, like very, very low pH, you're going to have denaturing of proteins and stuff of that nature. But again, these are all living cells, so I don't really see an issue. And if you're pitching at the beginning of fermentation, your wort's going to be just normal. And
sure.
Again, 20 minutes to get up to ramping speed. Every strain's a little bit different. We have some that are a little bit slower. Like USO5 is a little bit slower. With that one, I definitely recommend temperature adjustment, and I always pitch on the high end with that one, of the pitching rate, that is.
Why is that? What do you find about that kind of necessitates that, or is helped by that?
Well, for me, I like my fermentations to go a little bit faster. USO5 is a clean strain. We kind of have a running joke that it's the most lager-like ale strain out there. And so when you're pitching between ales and lagers, as you know, lagers are going to require a higher pitch rate. And that's what we see with USO5 as well, that it performs a lot better. A lot of times we will get calls and we'll say, hey, it's a little bit slow. We know the strain, it works fine, but I always combat it just going on. We have a range, right? It's like 40 to 80 or so. And I always just go on the high end of that range. And I really combat a lot of issues. I think people run into a lot of issues by not knowing what the strain is, not knowing the details and the nuances of it, and always trying to kind of skimp a little bit on the pitch rate. And there's definitely some that I would pitch on the lower end, for instance. So I'm not just trying to, sling the yeast.
Sure. Yeah.
But I would say, because these are technical questions that actually make a big impact.
Yes.
So USO5, I pitch on the high end. If I'm looking at, like you said earlier, when we're talking about like the Hefeweizens, right? We have a Weinsteffen strain W68, and that's what the W stands for. It comes from the Weinsteffen Brewing. That strain, I'm always pitching on the low end. I'm always like 50 grams per hectoliter. Fermentation temperature is right in the middle, because again, what you're going to get from Hefeweizen strain, and this is why I actually love the Hefeweizen style so much, is because so much of this, what defines this like beer style, comes from yeast. And you can, really make a great yeast, or sorry, you can make a great yeast, sure, but you can really make a great beer, or a kind of so-so beer, just how you treat the yeast. And it's really, really important in this style. And I'll tell you a different story about how I really became even more appreciative of this yeast in a minute. But with that one, I always pitch on the low end. So I'm like 40 grams, 50 grams per hectoliter, fermentation temperature, and the medium range, maybe, room temperature, maybe a little bit warmer, so 68. And then you're going to get very good isoamyl acetate. You want that banana, you want the clove. It's going to perform well. If you have W68, right, and you're making F, what I would seriously avoid doing is pitching too much yeast on that strain, and then also fermenting at too high of a temperature. That's a recipe for off flavors.
So I think, well, first of all, I think it's, and this is just, I think Hef and Belgian beers are the two styles / yeast categories that people have some of the largest range of approaches with and thoughts on. So I do brew days where I go in. I was just with Market Garden Brewery in Cleveland. I was just over at Little Miami, close to me here. They were both brewing Hef. They both had wildly different approaches with what they were doing on the yeast side, because as you mentioned, it's yeast is driving. Yeast is driving that beer. They're yeast-driven beers, and everybody has so many different approaches with this. I think it's so fascinating. Like you said, whether it's pitch rate, whether it's oxygen, whether it's fermentation temperature. Now, I also know that Hef strains seem to be, they've given me more problems over the years than almost any other one. Not just because it's like, okay, well, dialing in my balance between my clove and banana, but also I've pulled sulfur off of some of those. I've been disappointed because I pulled sulfur, like kind of problematic sulfur, off of, just a straight Hefeweizen. I pulled a harvest off of it, and I'm looking at the harvest, and I'm like, what is this? This is like, there's almost no slurry to be pulling at that point, because I was just using standard practices that I had used with the harvest lager strain and juice, both imperial products, right? And I was pulling great harvests off of those, X, Y, and Z. And then I pull this harvest that is seriously pushing me into a deep depression. I throw it into I throw into the second generation Dunkelweiss that I do, and the Dunkel's a banger. Now, don't get me wrong, I was excited that the Dunkel was really great, and I did deal with the sulfur in the original Hef.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's a finicky strain. What is it about that? Because I know some people will say they'll only use one generation at.
I do my best. This thing. You're driving it hard and putting it away wet, as they say. You gotta take care of your yeast.
But I had bought a liquid pitch, and then I threw it in, and I did the same yeast nutrient that I had always done. But it's been one of the few that gives me fusses like that. You know what I mean? Do you think it is like a little bit more of a fussy strain, or is it that I am just an abusive brewer?
No. I think your experience is is kind of typical of someone that's trying to use a strain like that for the first time. And I don't know if I would call it a fussy strain. The way that I think about it is, yeast is a tool in the toolbox, because as brewers, right? And when you're looking at your toolbox full of yeast strains, you have some that are workhorses, right? You've got like W3470, it's a workhorse. USO5 is a workhorse. You can kind of abuse it. You can, you can abuse it, kind of.
Yes.
Fussy is not the right word. I would say it's more like W68 or a Hefeweizen strain. It's more of an instrument. It's more fine-tuned. And you as a brewer have to be a little bit more fine-tuned in the way that you use it. So one thing that we used to do at the Liquid Yeast Lab is that we would really advocate for higher pitch rates, industry standard high pitch rates, which solved a lot of technical calls that we got. And it really does. And we also became really familiar with like what strains need heavy oxygen, because that's a huge thing too when you're pitching liquid or you're repitching a strain. It's is it a high oxygen demanding strain?
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes to strains like your Hefeweizen strain, right? I mentioned earlier, this is a strain that I pitch on the low end. So if you're over pitching, it's not going to be a good recipe for you. So you really have to consider a lot of things. You're starting, your original gravity is important. Your pitch rate, and again, on the low end is going to be a really huge factor. I mean, I would say that's probably the most important factor. And I think you can probably trust me on that, because obviously I'm not trying to sling more. I'm trying to sling yes here.
Yeah.
All right. So there's no benefit for me. But yeah, that's super important there. And then also, I would say the easiest thing besides your pitch rate to control is going to be the temperature, as long as you have like a good system. And a lot of yeast do really well in ranges, and your Hefeweizens, it's okay, but you don't want to abuse it either. And so getting a combination of 2 or 3 of those things in the wrong ratio, it's going to throw some off flavors. And one of those is sulfur. And so if I had to guess, I would say you're probably using, I'm not sure what liquid lab it was coming from, but if you're using one that was standardized at a higher pitch rate, there's a good chance you just pitch too much yeast.
Sure. Well, and it blew my mind, because the next year when I went back to it, because it was kind of a seasonal thing, I went with, I had a buddy who loves hef, makes great hef, and he goes, listen, you're pitching too much yeast. He goes, this is how much yeast I buy when I'm doing this. And it broke my heart, and it scared me. Right. Because for me, I was raised on big fat pitches, baby.
Yeah.
We're going to have big, healthy pitches rolling into this thing.
Right.
And I mean, because that, like I said, going back to the homebrew days, that's what the guys I was listening to said. Hey, listen, you're going to be making better homebrew than most people if you just have healthy, appropriately sized pitches going into your ferments, and you can keep your fermentation under wraps temperature wise. So I'm like, hell yeah. So I'm on it. So that's interesting. It takes me to another thing on the dry yeast side. Some things that kind of like, once you form your habits, it can be scary doing different things. To my understanding, I'm not supposed to be oxygenating a beer that I am dry pitching into, correct? Those yeasts do not need oxygen when I'm knocking out, correct?
I'd say for the most part, that's true. Now, there are some instances, when I was at the liquid yeast company, when I'm at the dry yeast company now, when you start to get the high gravity fermentations, really anything over 15 Plato, things start to change a little bit. But if you're making a regular beer, you're pitching your workhorse dry, there really shouldn't need to be any oxygenation. The way that the yeast is made, and I went to the production plant last year and then again this year in Belgium to see the way that they're made. And actually, we had a tour guide, right? So the guy that's worked there for 30, almost 40 years, maybe even more. Really great guy. And I really grilled him. I was like, coming from, running liquid, growing so many different strains. I'm like, so how you do this? Well, what's this?
Yeah.
We do this.
Yeah.
And like, kind of like test him a little bit. He knew me. He remembered me the second time I came.
I bet.
But it's really interesting because the way that they do it, right? So you'll get into most liquid yeast companies, they grow through like fermentation growth. So the same way that most breweries do it. Once you get to a certain size, you're going to switch over to cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is going to be more efficient when you're feeding nutrients and sugar, like your carbohydrates and your nitrogen, potassium, that type of stuff. And so what happens is, I can't tell you everything that he told me, but
sure.
Towards the end, they kind of manipulate the environment. And what happens is most of the cells get to the same mature stage of growth, and they have robust cell walls. And so that helps with a couple different things. Not only does it help with the drying process, but it also helps with rehydration and the lack of the need for oxygen. The reason that you oxygenate a liquid pitch or a repitch is because you want to feed the oxygen in there for the sterols, specifically for like ergostosol, and that's needed when cells are growing. Now these cells are mature and they're ready to rock for the most part.
What does that do while the cells are growing? Is that like, so one of the things, and I always understand things on a functional, non-scientific level. But one of the things that I always heard was an appropriate oxygenation rate helps to facilitate a yeast cell's ability to like recover from like budding. And as far as like making the cell wall, I don't know if like more pliable or more able to bud healthily. Does that sound like a thing, or does that sound like something I'm making up?
No, I think it's rooted in truth, right? And so when you're talking about like the cell wall, and you're talking about it recovering from budding, I would say, chitin is deposited around the bud scars, and so that's going to help it recover from budding and help scar over and heal those areas. When the cells are growing, basically, you're putting it into wort. Wort's a stressful environment for a lot of reasons. So what helps is having a robust cell wall, and it can be thick. So I've also read reports that if you increase the diversity of sugars and carbohydrates, you get a thicker cell wall. And that's because they're more active in their transporters and proteins that are on the cell wall on the outside and that are active. But what's important with the oxygen content is whenever you're dosing that oxygen after you pitch, the liquid yeast is starting to grow. It takes it up, it forms ergostosol. And ergostosol you can think of very similar to human cholesterol. It's analogous. And so, if you have high cholesterol, or your family member, basically what happens is it gets into your arteries and it's going to harden up the arteries. And it does the same thing with the yeast cell. It's going to get in there and it's going to make those cell walls more robust. And the more robust the cell wall is, the more resistant it is, for the most part, to stresses. And so that's going to help it grow because it depletes as they bud off. And this might be where we're kind of touching, together ideas, is that when it buds off, it needs to make more of that ergostosol. And so providing it with the nutrient, oxygen is a nutrient just like nitrogen is, in that time of need, it's going to be, critical for proper development. But, dry yeast, it's mature, it's ready to go. There has been some experience where if you're pitching at ultra high gravity, some oxygen can help. Sure.
So tell me if this is an old wives' tale or if this is a real thing. I've heard that, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking liquid or dry right now. I've heard this no matter what. Some people will say, I got a new pitch and it's probably going to be the third generation where I really start hitting my stride with the strain, where it's really doing its thing. Have you heard talk like that before? What do you think about that? Do you think there's any truth to that, or do you feel as if generation 1 through 5, all things consistent? Is it going to be? Are you going to notice differences between those fermentations?
That is something I've also heard. I've never been able to confirm that before. Never designed any experiments around it, but I have heard, just like at industry events, and it's never from someone directly. It's always like, well, I've heard that maybe some industrial brewers will take the first fermentation and they'll hold it back and then they'll ferment 2 or 3 times and they back blend one until it really gets to its stride. I actually don't know anyone that's doing that. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. Sure. I don't know anyone that's doing that. I would say that there's probably, this goes back to knowing your strain. Maybe it's a very specific strain that operates that way.
Yep.
I'm not really sure, to be honest with you, but
Well, and I think it's interesting because one of the spots where I worked, we would sometimes do krausening. So we would do a double batch, and then we'd be in active fermentation 24 hours later, and then we would pull X number of barrels off of that one fermentation as our yeast pitch on the next. And I thought it was interesting that you could side by side those two versions of that beer, and it was a production beer, something that we made a lot of. You could side by side those two beers, and I think the ester profile was different when handling it like that. Now that's a different prop technique and different things like that. You know what I mean? But yeah, that is one that I've always heard. And the other thing that I actually want to give you,
I'd be super interested to see what the pitch rate and the temperature, whether it was all the same.
Sure.
Because we've done a lot of work into our yeast, and we've had repeatability between experimental batches, but I don't know if we've ever tested that.
Sure. Well, and something that I want to thank you for, and I think a lot of times people, I talk to one person a week on this podcast, and one of the things that I love is I love when people are comfortable saying, yeah, I'm not sure about the research on that. Because I think sometimes, whether we're brewers, other professionals within the industry, there's a lot of things to know. And to just feel like you just have to know everything and have an answer for every specific thing, there's too much stuff. So first of all, I like that about you. I like having conversations like this, because I'm just asking anything about anything. So sometimes we're gonna stumble on something like that. So, anyways, I think it's a hat tip thing to you. So I appreciate it. So let me throw out another one. So we
keep them coming.
First, okay. So actually, I'm realizing we're at 60 minutes right now.
I've got time.
Okay.
I've got time. I mean, if you're here for me to say I don't know a couple more times.
No. Okay, so a term that I hear, in different applications or in different situations is when people say, okay, well, when we're going generation to generation, I think I had heard about some stuff specifically with lager strain, and I could be wrong with that, but people talk about petite mutants. What can you peel into that a little bit for us? My understanding is just from generation to generation, you can be creating yeasts that are just functionally different than what the base strain is intended to be. And over time, through serial repitching, you can end up with a fundamentally different strain, or air quote strain or whatever. Can you talk to us about petite mutants, what they are, and how they come about?
Yeah, I can. Petite mutants. I first learned about this when I was in grad school, and it's a pretty interesting concept. So, petite, obviously it means small. And so the way that this came about is researchers, scientists, yeast nerds like myself, they were plating yeast. And when you have a petite mutant, sometimes the way that it appears is on a plate, you have big colonies and a small colony. It's still obviously a yeast cell. And this depends on, on your agar plate, what is your media composed out of, what's your carbohydrate source. And so the way that you would test this, the way that I would test this is if you, flood your plate or you streak them out, you have big and small, you mark them, and then you would do, what is it called? It's basically called stamping. You take a sterilized velvet cloth, and you can wrap it along this circular device. It's more or less a stamp, and you can replica plate. That's what it's called, replica plating onto the next one. And then you try it with different medias. And so petite mutants, how they come about specifically is that they have a a deficiency in their mitochondria, and so they can't metabolize glycerol, for instance. So if you replica plated this onto a glycerol plate and it didn't grow, you would probably be pretty safe in saying that it's probably a petite mutant. But when it comes to how it comes about from the spontaneity of it forming, there's a lot of different ways, because yes, it could happen from serial repitching. Any kind of storage that happens with yeast, you run the risk of developing petite mutants. And this could be, you can do this in a lab through mutagenesis. So if you take, let's say, UV light, for instance, and you radiate the yeast, there's a chance that you create some petite mutants. And again, it's a respiratory deficiency in the mitochondria. Now, there was a paper that I read when I first started banking quite a lot for the liquid yeast company out of Portland. And there's a couple ways that you can store yeast for long-term storage, right? So you can store it with negative 80 degrees Celsius freezers, which is, I think, most common for like high-tech labs. It's the way that I have the most experience with. I also used to store some yeast in cryogenic tubes and liquid nitrogen. It's super cold. It's more than negative 80.
Sure.
But it's a fun little thing to have around your lab if you're into playing gags.
Yeah.
If you dry, there's a chance for that too. If you keep your yeast under mineral oil and a slant, there's a chance for that. If you keep them on an agar plate, wrapped and exposed to oxygen, there's a chance for it as well. So they can develop naturally depending on your storage conditions. And so, yeah, I'd say that's kind of the cold crash 101 on treatments.
Sure. And it's my understanding that you don't need a tremendous amount of them. Like if you're just going to say what percentage of your total cells, it's my understanding that you don't need a very large percentage of them for that to potentially have a relatively significant impact on your fermentation. Is that the case?
I think that's a really good question. I have never done a study on that.
Sure.
But I would imagine that there's kind of there's going to be a threshold, right? Like if you're, I'm just making up numbers here, but if you're, 10% petite mutants, that probably is quite a lot to develop, through spontaneous action. So, I don't know how that would affect it. I wouldn't think that it would be too much because, okay, let's think about it. Unless they're throwing off flavors, right? Let's maybe just say petite mutants are slow. If you're off on your pitch by 10%, it's not going to be a huge. I mean, it's a little bit off, right? But it's not going to be a huge deal. You're not like pitching half. Yeah. So, I'd have to say that really just depends on the percentage and how these petite mutants are showing up. Are they simply just a mitochondria deficiency, or do they have other mutations that are going on that are creating something else? So I think that there's some co-factors, if you will. Sure. Yeah, but if let's try that experiment out, though. Yeah. Find a brewery that wants to make 10 barrels of some bad beer, potentially bad.
For sure. So I've got a question, and I get a wide range of usernames in here, but this question comes in from Soul Flair, and he says, does a product like Go Firm Sterol Flash have any application here for dry yeast rehydration? So I don't know how familiar you are with that product, but if you could speak to something like that, and potentially maybe just like dry yeast and nutrient in general. Because is there any difference with what we need to be doing nutrient-wise with dry yeast compared to liquid strains?
A couple of things to unpack there. So I guess I have to admit I'm not sure what that product is. So it's Go Firm what?
Sterol, Sterol Flash. It sounds like maybe a newer
Sterol Flash. Okay,
Sterol
so it's like
Flash.
A lipid, high lipid.
Yeah, maybe.
Nutrient.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it is. Happy to chat about it more, maybe offline. But if I'm just reading into the name, it sounds like maybe it's a high sterol, probably like yeast cell wall extracts. there's a time and place, I think, for nutrients, and it really
Mm-hmm.
depends on what you're fermenting. So if you are fermenting something, or, again, your yeast strain depends on what its nutritional requirements are. Usually when people look at nutrients, they look at a couple things. They start with nitrogen, but that's not the whole story. So when they're talking about, and that's especially true for like propagation, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're fermenting, you're looking at about at least 150 ppm of nitrogen is kind of like a base level where most yeast strains perform well. But I don't think it has a real big purpose in dry yeast rehydration. If I'm being honest, hopefully I'm not wrong on that. But there's
So
nothing really that's needed to
sure,
make the fermentation go
sure.
successfully.
But then on the subsequent repitches, though,
Mm-hmm.
you would recommend like either a hot side or cold side nutrient addition, like I would normally use for a repitch.
Yeah, I think nutrients are important. I think it's one of the areas that some fermentation experts like brewers, they kind of overlook.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been guilty of this too, whether it's on the homebrew scale or doing pilot systems. But it's kind of cool that you asked me, because I think really dialing in your nutrients, and this includes zinc, while you're going through fermentation and repitching, is something that's important. And sometimes it can even help if you get your zinc content down. It can even help clean up some like off flavors, or slow metabolites, for instance. Like sometimes it can even help in the back. If you timing of zinc and other nutrient addition also is important. It's something that we don't do a lot as brewers, but it actually is important. So pitching a little bit of zinc on the back end can help with some sulfur reduction sometimes, for instance, depending on the process.
When you say on the back end, do you mean like at the beginning, like at yeast pitch when you're filling up a fermenter, or do you mean at some other point?
Yeah, at least a third to halfway through fermentation. Sometimes at the end, a lot of that sulfur gets cleaned up at the end, or diacetyl gets cleaned up at the end, and sometimes giving them a little boost helps. We have, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, we have some experimental products that I'm working on. And so if you go to the Brewing Summit next month, I'm actually going to be kind of co-presenting a presentation with someone that's been using one of our products as an experimental one. So we're figuring out the details, but it's for propagation, and it's for like high gravity fermentations. And we've seen some really, really great results with that. So I think, again, nutrient is going to be really important when you're coming to finishing your fermentation, hitting the attenuation that you need, and then also making a yeast stock that's healthy to continue on and be repitched. And one thing I wanted to say this earlier, but I kind of forgot. We just talked about zinc a little bit, and it's super cool. People talk about zinc. It's like one of the nutrients that you definitely need. Many different yeast companies, yeast extract companies, come out with solutions for this, and even people that don't even make yeast come out with solutions for this. But part of my PhD work was working with copper nanoparticles, and so I learned a lot about transition metals and how they interact with the yeast cell. And so what's really cool about doing some of that, part of mine was on yeast hybrids in Japan, and then part of it was with copper nanoparticles. And one thing that's really interesting, I learned a lot about zinc throughout this process, because copper and zinc would replace each other sometimes. And out of the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the brewer's yeast, out of their proteome, so take all the proteins in the cell, right? That's your proteome. And if you look at them as a snapshot, about 10% of all of the proteins require some kind of metal cofactor to work correctly. And half of those are going to be preference for zinc. So 5%, half of all metal cofactor proteins need zinc. It's what the proteins love. Proteins love zinc to work properly, because as a protein, you need to have the correct structure, which is going to lead to the correct function, right? And zinc's really needed for that. So if you don't believe zinc's important, it's at least 5% of the protein.
And I hear more and more people talking about it, and it's, for me, it's anecdotal, but it's people that I've come up really respecting. I always, one of the reasons that I like doing what I'm doing right now with the online content stuff is so many people have shared things with me over the years, whether it be in podcast form or whatever. I love getting free information out to people. And I remember talking on a few occasions with Julian Schrago from Beechwood, and I've heard him give some talks. I interviewed him, and he's just always had great information, and just always an open book. And he was talking about they shifted their zinc additions to the cold side, because they were finding that they could more accurately tell how much zinc they were getting into their wort and not losing it to trub on the hot side. And he said, like,
you nailed it.
He said they've shaved sometimes, in some cases, days off of fermentations. And I mean, it's not like 8 days or anything, but
right.
You know what I mean? But you're cleaning up faster. They've gotten healthier repitches, more robust repitches. You know what I mean? And he's also said that you can go too far with it too. He said that they've absolutely just, bricked out the yeast in the bottom of the tank before and couldn't really get it out, because they kind of pushed the high side on that. I think it's a really interesting thing, especially when people are they don't have enough tanks, and they're maybe thinking about buying a tank, and you're in a production environment. If you can shave 24 hours off of one of your turn times on a tank, that counts as something. That's a real thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of return on investment on that strategy there. And I think your contact there really nailed it when they said that cold side addition is the way to go. Yeah, you can add hot. A lot of people do it. It's kind of the standard for the industry. I'm not exactly sure why. I think people are afraid to put anything on the cold side, just for contamination. Which I get it, but honestly, you shouldn't be that scared. You should, make a sterile solution. It's definitely possible.
Yes.
But as you mentioned, if you do it on the hot side, basically all that zinc gets bound up, and you're just wasting money. It's probably not that much, but you are just wasting time, wasting money. Add on the cold side, it's going to be accessible to the yeast. It makes the yeast healthier. It helps with fermentation kinetics. And you should target, I think, what is it, like 0.1 ppm, I think is your target. Or
off the top of my head, I'm not certain. I would have to go back and do a little digging.
But I think that's a good way to go about it.
Sure.
You can get, I would say, if your math's off, right? Like, you can be toxic to cells if you give them too much transition metal. I think that's important to know too. Like, if you're doing that, like understanding what your water profile is. If you have too much other transition metals, like if you have too much iron, specifically you have too much copper. So copper and zinc together, they kind of act synergistically to act toxic to the cell. It might not be that really relevant in the brewing context, but I think it is important to not overdose zinc as well. You just want to get it to the right level.
Yes. Yeah.
And
yeah, that's interesting. So, we've had a bunch of ideas that we have kind of laid out, and we are kind of rolling in toward the close. So, is there anything, I can kind of turn the wheel over to you at all? Is there anything that you would be interested in specifically chatting about with our listeners about the work you do? What you've learned on your side, messages or tips or tricks that you would like to be getting out to brewers? What are some things that you'd like to bring up here?
Oh, wow. So the world is my oyster, at least.
The world's your oyster,
Makes Beer podcast is for the next 10 minutes.
Hands off the wheel. Off the wheel.
Hey, my name's not Jesus, but I will take it. Adam, thanks for asking me that. I think that there's a couple really interesting things that have come about in the last 2 years that I've been working at Fermentis, and also the last 10 years I've been, being more involved with the craft beer world as a yeast guy. And I think, there's a couple of things that I'd like to advocate for. Number one is going to be attending the conferences. I'm part of the ASBC. I'm the program director. So all the content that comes out for the annual meeting, I have a big hand in, also all the webinars. So going to those meetings is huge. It's, we don't have local meetings. So this is the one meeting this year is actually going to be really, really cool. I'm speaking at it. We've got a global panel that's going to be presiding. We've got 3 great keynote speakers. We just did a webinar series on, whiskey flavor development. We have another one coming on wood sciences with Peter Burkhart. We've got another one on THP and sour beer with Glenn Fox. So obviously, with those being said, I'm a big advocate of participating in like professional societies, and continually as we're doing now, just talking, chatting, whether it's technical or just making contact. It's altogether what we're doing is we're raising the brewing science bar, and we're making it higher and higher. And so one thing that I have really enjoyed about being in the beer industry is just the collaborative nature of everyone that I talk to. It's just like a really great industry, and it's like, there's not a lot of people that hold stuff very close to their chest. There are some, and some things are needed, but in general, everyone's really passionate. That's something that we should maintain every year, right? Multiple times throughout the year. As far as, I guess, doing work together with me, there's a couple things that I'm working on. So since I joined the team with Fermentis, we've been more interested in partnering on custom solutions. So, if there's anything you're really interested in, really reaching out to us, it's possible to have these discussions. And so there's a whole world of opportunities out there. And if you're in a position where you can do some research, there's a contact of mine that's able to do some of that research I'm talking about with doing, propagation systems in the pilot, and getting, on the lab scale, getting 100% more yeast, 50% more yeast in the pilot scale, and having cleaner fermentations, faster diacetyl pickup or cleanup. And it does the same thing. It's a return on that investment where you are able to increase your capacity and turn tanks faster. It's huge. It's a really cool nutrient. It's a yeast complete autolysate that I'm working with. And then there's all kinds of yeast strains that we've been coming out with now. So there's probably, when I first started with liquid yeast, it was, well, what's the main benefit of liquid yeast? It's, we have a liquid yeast producer has major selection, right? It's super easy to go from a slant to go to like a 1 barrel or 10 barrel pitchable, liquid culture. I'd say that gap is closing quite a lot. And so since I've been with Fermentis for like the past year and a half, 2 years, I think we've released at least 4 or 5 different strains. So we've gotten 2 or 3 new lager yeast. We got another one that's coming out like right now. It's on thials. So it's a lager yeast dedicated to thial production. It's non-GMO, but selected through academic partnership. We've got just a handful of yeast that are cool, especially that W68 that I was talking about. I'd say if I'm going to wrap this up with a story, it kind of something I mentioned earlier, and it has to do with W68, the Hefeweizen strain from Weinstefan. And I had never been to Europe before last year, and for me, it was like a huge deal. And I had a really like fascinating time learning about culture, and it was really cool going for work because I've, just to be completely honest, like when I first heard Fermentis, I was definitely a liquid yeast guy. I was the dry yeast, those big Goliaths that can't move very quick. Okay. And I'm like super impressed because in the past, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, so right before I joined, they just completed what they call their Fermentis campus, and they have this amazing pilot system. It's a custom Casper Schultz brewhouse, and it's like we have 41 hectoliter fermenters. Okay, so there's 40 hectoliter fermenters that you can play with.
Sure.
There's like, what else do we have? There's like, I don't know, like 10 hectoliters, maybe there's 8, and I've got the numbers here. There's 2 40 hectoliter fermenters, but really the crux, the really like cool thing to me is these like 1 hectoliter fermenters. And so the way that they do it, right, is they'll make a batch and they'll fill it up from the bottom. And so like 5 units will fill up at the same time. So they're all homogeneous. And they have all these sensors on there, and then we run these programs, right? And so not only is the brew house super cool, but the technology's there. And then what happens is it gets packaged and sent to this sensory unit that we have. It's I've been to a lot of breweries. I've seen sensory panels. This thing like blew my socks off. I was like, this is like real. I mean, like, this is like real science. This is like real sensory science. And a lot of times I'm like, oh, okay, I don't really kind of believe a lot of people sometimes with it.
Sure.
And sometimes they're lackadaisical. This is like super impressive. I mean, the statistics are there. And I was there for onboarding, like newcomers week is what they call it. And so they're showing us, and I've already seen this once, but they're doing like the official tour. And so I go in and I actually sit down as part of a panel, and I think they have like 3 panels. And I mean, they have multiple panels that they run every week. And if we come to a talk, I'll be a little bit more polished about how we talk about the panels and get some more solid numbers. But, I think the real meat of the story here is like, I come in and I'm sitting in this room. It's like basically white room, and there's desks all together, and they're shaped kind of like a U around this room. They have a TV in the front, and I'm sitting down there with a bunch of people who are new to the company. Of course, when I picked my seat, I went to the very back middle. I want to see it all.
Yes.
And I'm sitting there, and they start the presentation. They hit a button at the very front, and just kind of like a movie, you have this slow rising booth dividers that come up. It's like, it's got to be a slow rise because it's dramatic. And it is like sensory deprivation. They have these glasses that come out. They're all blacked out, so you can't see anything. Different color lights. They got iPads that you can do the judging, and it shows up statistics in real time. It's super impressive. But so we start doing an actual panel, and they're like, okay, we've got 4 different samples. Taste these samples, judge them. I'm doing it. I'm like, okay, this one's super isoamyl. I get a little bit of phenolic clove on the back end. Like, okay, it's a little bit, I think I taste some wheat in there. Okay. This is like, okay, I think I know what this one is. I'm judging it. And the second one, I'm like, oh, okay, this is, it's a little bit less. I go through all 4 of them.
Sure.
And they show us the results, and it looks like there's 3 different strains up there. And so they start talking, and I just couldn't hold it any longer. And I was like, okay, I have to ask, what strain is this, right? Like, I'm the technical lead for the Americas in beer. I'm like, I know what's going on. I'm like, what strain is this? And they're like, well, what do you think it is? And I said, well, I was like, A has to be W68. Like, I know this, I can tell. And they're like, yeah, you're right. And I was like, yes. And they're actually like, they're all W68. And I was just like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And they're like, no, they're all W68, and they're part of the what we call like a baseline, and it's when they change the conditions to see how the yeast responds.
Yes.
And it's like they change the fermentation temperature, they change the pitch rate, they change the starting gravity, and so it's like these things really, really matter when it comes to like strain W68 for the Hefeweizen, because like I said earlier, it's more of like an instrument, right? It's a fine-tuned instrument. And so you have your workhorses, and then you have your fine-tuned yeast strains. And I when I was tasting them, I could have sworn that these were 3 different yeast strains, if not 4.
Sure.
Yeah, that blew me away when I was there.
That's cool. Well, listen, before we wrap, I have one more thing. So I actually had a listener submit this question, and I'm going to amend it a little bit. I
Live?
am
They
a
submitted it live?
no. Well, there was another one that was the other one before was live, but this
Okay.
one came in on Facebook before. And I'm going to supplement the question. So they were asking for on the dry side your go-to hazy IPA yeast, New England style IPA yeast, and then I would also like to supplement it with I was a big user of the Harvest strain from Imperial, which I believe is kind of referred to as like the Augustiner strain.
Oh yeah.
Is there a comp on the dry side for that? So give me 2 dry side takes for those two liquid strains.
Based on that question, I have an idea of who asked that. Actually, all the questions that have come in, I've got ideas of who's asked this because I also posted this on my my Instagram. So
nice.
Maybe the people are asking me the tough questions here. But these are questions I enjoy.
Sure.
So there's a lot of options for hazy IPAs. My favorite one is K97 for the dry side. I like using K97. I think it produces the best stable haze. If you look at any of the papers that have come out recently, when they investigate the like haze proteins on the cell wall, and they usually survey, right? And so you're going to have like some London varieties. You also have some Kolsch varieties, English varieties and I think the Kvike Voss is usually pretty high up there as well. Those ones are going to be really good about forming stable haze. And so those are where I would go. So for me, it's K97. It's going to be a kind of like a Kolsch derivative. I mean, you can, again, these are tools, so you use them how you can see fit. SO4 is going to be a pretty good one for us as well. SO4 is like, it can drop out and flocculate pretty well, but it can also form a stable haze, which is going to be an English variety. To date, there's no London 3 derivative. When I was with Imperial, A38 was kind of our bread and butter. It's a great strain. It had some nuances to it. With that one, it's a super high oxygen demand.
Yes.
And it's going to climb out of your tank. That's the way that one is. So, for dry side, I'd say K97 or SO4. Those are my go-tos. I also mentioned earlier that we've been releasing new strains left and right. We've got new solutions. So I would stay tuned. I don't know for sure, but there's a chance that there's maybe something coming down the pipe.
Sweet.
And what was the other portion of that?
Like an Augustiner type lager strain.
Oh, yeah. That's super interesting because I've talked about Augustiner, right? Like I started going to conferences as a liquid yeast supplier, and I would have breweries come up and they'd ask, and this is when I was very new, and they'd ask, oh, do you have an Augustiner strain? I'm like, I came from, I guess I kind of cut my teeth with all the old guys. Well, not old guys. Sorry if they're all listening. But some of the more experienced guys from.
There you go, more experienced.
The wiser guys from Yeast, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, they were the original name of the game, and they have a ton of a great experience. And so I'd work with them, and I'd say, hey, what's the Augustiner strain? Like, how does this work? And so I got a lot of great information that way, and it's something that we talk about a lot, and I continue to ask about the Augustiner strain. And from like what I've been able to tell, that I don't know this for sure, right? This is all hearsay, but I hear that it's more than one strain. I think there's a series or there's co-pitches involved. But from what I do understand is that there's a slight sulfur signature that comes from the Augustiner strain, which is why it's desired. And to that, I would say there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You can play with your nutrient content and the timing of the addition. But for me, when I'm looking at the dry yeast selection, You can use 3470. It's not my preference for an Augustiner. 3470 is just really neutral, clean. I mean, it's a workhorse.
Sure.
S189 has the potential to fill that gap, but it just always depends on how you treat your yeast, right? So if you're making something like, a traditional lager and you're doing a slower cold crash, that's going to help keep the yeast in suspension longer, and it's also going to help them clean up some of that sulfur. Depending on what your brewing practices are, you can get a sulfur signature from different lager strains. So S189 wouldn't be a bad one to go to. S23 is also one that we have that has some potential there. So
for sure.
Yeah, the Augustiner one, it's I don't know if anyone actually works there and has experiences. Please let me know because I've gotten pretty close to the person that holds all the cards, but I haven't ever been able to get a straight answer from anyone.
For sure.
What's your experience? I mean, why do you? I mean, are you familiar with the strain? Why do you like it, and what do you want to get from it?
What I like about it,
to use it?
Yeah, and so for me, what I love about that strain is I've always the first lager I ever brewed at home was just Helles. Just German style Helles. And I remember being blown away by taking sulfur out of the equation. Not that it was a big sulfur bomb. I did have sulfur during that fermentation, but
no sulfur bombs, like a sulfur signature, like a
sure, yeah, absolutely. Well, I was fermenting. So this was when I was homebrewing. So I was fermenting in a
bucket.
No, well, I was in a glass fermenter, but it was inside of a chest freezer that was temperature controlled.
Oh yeah,
so exactly, right.
Mine was an old ice cream scooper. It was an old ice cream scooper freezer I got.
For sure. So, but when I had that fermentation, I forget if it was a little later or a little earlier, but it did start to kick off some sulfur. So when I would open up the thing, there was some sulfur in there. But what I loved about that the first time I'd ever used lager yeast, I'm like, oh, this is what clean means. As far as a lack of esters, right? So there was that, but then what I love specifically about that Augustiner type yeast is for me personally, I think it creates a flavor range that is a malt magnifier. So for me, especially in beers that are austere, like something like Helles, because it's not the most. Obviously, it's a malty beer, right? But I mean, it's not like Oktoberfest or Märzen or Bach. Oh, yeah, exactly, right. And so, what I love about taking a smaller style like that, and for me, that the Augustiner strain it's just kind of a malt magnifier. It does a really good job of creating a flavor profile that accentuates and gives depth to those beers, right? And I just love, and maybe it's just, and maybe, I don't know. I personally think there's so many things about lager fermentations, especially for people that are not German, that are chasing traditional styles that they've never drank fresh before on the ground. You're always chasing some magical thing, right? So functionally, that's one thing. That's a flavor aroma thing that I like about it. But I also find it very, very easy to use in the brewery. It can accept a wider range of temperature than I think some other strains can. It is reliable for a harvesting standpoint. I think it's easy to use. It's forgiving, and I think it has a. It's not 3470. 3470 is great. But that can be ultra clean. And it's not that this isn't clean, but I think it's a malt magnifier. That's my too long answer on that. So But yeah, well, listen, man, we will wrap. This was really great getting to chat with you today. It's always good to catch up. I'm going to ask that you just hold on for just a minute after we go, after we end the stream. I just want to chat with you for a second. But again, it was great to have you on. It was good to talk yeast. I love talking to people who are passionate about what they do. So yeah, it was a good conversation. I was glad we were able to find a time that worked.
Well, Adam, I appreciate the invitation again, and this almost 2 hours talking has been wonderful. I mean that sincerely. And,
for sure.
I appreciate the questions from everyone. I can't wait to see everyone in the ASBC in California next month. And if you have anything, a question, or want to connect somehow, I'm Matt Winans. You can find me with Google. So happy to connect to anyone. But thanks again, Adam. I appreciate the opportunity and everyone's time.
Absolutely. Hey, and to everybody out there listening, I appreciate it. Please just a reminder, content creation is my full-time gig. So any sharing, questions, saving, liking that you can do in the online space, and also sharing with other brewing friends, definitely helps me out. So anyways, that's it. I'll be in your ears. I might take next week off. My oldest son is getting married first weekend of August, so it's a very busy time here. But anyways, as always, I appreciate you guys listening and all your support, and we will catch you next time.